but moving us along, I'll be moving us into our feature presentation for the evening on Portland Harbor institutional controls with a focus on Multnomah County's fish consumption education and outreach program. Before I introduce the presenters, please note that members, you are more than welcome to raise your hands or put questions in the meeting chat. However, we will be holding questions until the end of the presentation. I'll make sure to gather your questions in the order they are received. And if your question doesn't get answered in this main time allotted, please join those breakout rooms from 7 to 8 o'clock. For non-members or those observing, just a reminder to please hold any of your questions until those breakout rooms from 7 to 8. All right, let's get started. Josie Clark, Remedial Project Manager with EPA, is going to kick this presentation off. So over to you, Josie.
Thanks, Lucila. So tonight we're going to talk about institutional controls, and I'm going to say that a lot. And if I slip and accidentally start talking about ICs, that's the same thing, but I'm going to really stick with institutional controls. I'm going to start with a brief overview of what institutional controls are, and then I'm going to turn it over to Beth, who's going to talk in detail about the Fish Advisory Education and Outreach Program. Beth's been doing a lot of really meaningful work that I'm excited for you all to hear about. So I'm going to kind of rush through my part, but I am in a breakout session later. So if you hear anything, you want to talk more, just come meet us in the breakout room. All right, next slide. So also the collaborative steering committee has been really helpful in helping us steer these presentations towards information that will be useful. So if you like what you hear, you should thank them later. Our hope tonight is that you'll learn more about institutional controls at Portland Harbor and why they're important. We'll talk about EPA's vision for implementing them into the future. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we get to hear from Beth Appert on that education and outreach work that supports the fish consumption advisory. Next slide. What are institutional controls? They're various informational, proprietary, and governmental controls that minimize human exposure to contaminants and protect the integrity of the remedy. I think it's useful to think about institutional controls in relation to engineering controls. So engineering controls are the things we build that protect human health, right? It's fences to keep people out, it's caps in the river, it's those concrete things, not necessarily made of concrete, but physical controls. And then institutional controls are the non-tangible components that supplement those engineering controls. And so we'll go through some examples and hopefully you'll start to get a sense of what those are. So the first example is regulated navigation areas. If they look at the figure that's on the screen, that's a screenshot from NOAA navigation charts. And this is an area by Willamette Cove. And one of the things on there is actually a line around the McCormick and Baxter cap. And there is a regulated navigation area there that prevents boats from dropping anchor as a protective measure for caps. So that's an example of an institutional control. Another example is the permitting process. When folks want to do dredging or filling in the river, they need approval from the Department of State Lands, right? That's the owner of that land. And so in the future, when somebody goes to apply for one of those permits, the Department of State Lands will look at where the caps are, where buried contamination is, and make sure that their action doesn't damage either the caps or expose buried contamination. And then a third example is the education and outreach component of the fish consumption advisory. So the fish consumption advisory itself is an institutional control that is in the purview of Oregon Health Authority. So EPA works closely with Oregon Health Authority to put that, to have that reflect a protective level of fish consumption. But ultimately, the success of this institutional control depends on widespread awareness and understanding from the community, which right needs to have an education and outreach program with it. So again, hopefully you're starting to sense kind of what's the difference between engineering control and an institutional control. And if you want to talk more about them in detail, come join me at 7. All right, next slide. Thanks. So then what's our vision? How are we going to actually implement these and make them real? Institutional controls cover a wide variety of things. They interface with existing government programs and property law, which means that coordination is really the key for this. And so the city of Portland and the state of Oregon entered into an agreement with EPA to write a programmatic institutional control plan And tentatively, we're hoping to publish that in June of this year. This plan will provide a roadmap for individual project areas to develop the land and waterway use restrictions that will protect their caps. And it also provides a roadmap for the statewide institutional control. So this includes the permitting process we talked about, the fish advisory, and it all comes together in that one programmatic document. Once the programmatic IC plan is in place, then we start on the next steps. We'll implement it through future agreements with working parties. So as part of every remedial design agreement, parties were required to produce a draft site-specific institutional control plan that will align with this programmatic one. And then as part of remedial action agreements, EPA will require the implementation of this plan into the future. And then the other part that we're going to need to continue, currently this program that Beth is about to talk about that is very cool, is being funded voluntarily by the port, the city, and the state. And that funding goes through June of 2023. But we're going to need to figure out how to do future funding, and that will either be done through a separate agreement or potentially as part of the remedial action consent decree. So that's a little nugget about what our institutional controls are and where we're headed with them. Now I get to turn it over to Annie Von Berg with the city, who will introduce Beth. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Josie. Hi, everyone. Well, I just wanted to give a brief kind of 1 minute overview of why we came together to start this work. We're really excited for you to hear about tonight. So a few years ago, the city of Portland, the Port of Portland, and the state of Oregon came together to fund the program that you're going to hear about from Beth. We heard directly from community that this was an area that needed improvement. So we pooled agency resources and asked Multnomah County Health Department if they would create a program that was not only responsive to the community, but really centered the needs of the community and used best methods and best practices for making sure that this the communication about risk of eating fish in this area was done as effectively as possible. We knew that having a site-wide approach that was led by public health experts would be much more effective than having those individual site-by-site approaches. And we also knew that it was important to get this site-wide program established so that it could build the relationships and continue to kind of provide that main conduit for this information for this phase of the project, and then continue the future phases as we go further in the cleanup process. So our hope is that by initiating the development of this program, that all responsible parties will contribute to kind of offering up and making sure that there is long-term stable funding for this important work, but ultimately EPA will decide how that gets done. So we'll look to them to guide us of what that looks like. But overall, we're really happy with the work that Beth has done up to this point and really look forward to you guys seeing this and providing feedback and hearing what you think. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Beth.
Thank you, Annie and Josie. It's really nice to be here tonight to share about this program. As you know, my name is Beth Appert. I use she, her pronouns, and I work in the Environmental Health Services Division of Multnomah County Health Department. And I'm going to share about the program that we started back in April of 2018. Next slide, please. So the topics that we're going to talk about tonight is, first of all, how was this program developed from the very beginning, because it was new to the county, and then what are the program components? And there are three main components. There's the community education campaign, direct outreach and education, and then the foundation of the program is capacity building of the communities that are most affected by this fish advisory. We'll talk a little bit about an evaluation that we plan and have some time, we hope, for questions. But as you heard, there will be breakout sessions at 7, and I'll be there for more questions if we run out of time. And I want to note that throughout this presentation, when I say resident fish, I'm talking about fish and shellfish. I might not say shellfish every time, but those are the fish that we're most concerned about with contamination, and they're fish that live basically their whole lives in this section of the river. So with the development of the program, I looked around the nation to see what are other people doing around their fish advisories and what's best practice. I looked at a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles, and I found this one that really was helpful. And it's not rocket science, but it says you really need to define that target audience first. And then you need to talk to that audience and find out how do they want to hear that message and what's the format that works for them. And then begin to develop materials together and use them with them. And throughout this presentation, you're going to see pictures that I took at different workshops that you'll hear more about later in the presentation. So this was my my guiding light as I worked on who am I going to reach out to? And I will note that there was no comprehensive needs assessment done to identify who are the people that fish and eat the fish from this section of the river, but there were some other areas where I found a lot of information that I'll share with you. Next slide, please. So the county uses something called an equity and empowerment lens for all of our programs. And it is to give priority to communities of color and culturally specific community groups. So I wanted to look at people that were really negatively impacted by this advisory. Those were the folks who eat that fish and shellfish. And then I wanted to look in communities where people are typically underserved. And finally, I really wanted to use a process that gives power to those who are often without a voice. And I will say that I reached out to EPA and looked at their community involvement plan. I talked with Jessica Terlikowski at the city because she had a lot of great contacts. I looked at the Portland Harbor Community Coalition website and looked at who they had listed as their partners on their website. And I also looked internally to a lot of folks that we work with at the county to start this dialogue to find out how do I hone in on who these folks are. Next slide, please. So I talked about comprehensive needs assessment was done to figure out who's eating these fish and fishing for these fish. But there have been some surveys and documents that really gave us a clear idea of who those folks are. And they're listed here. There was an angler survey that Willamette Riverkeepers conducted. The Oregon Health Authority did a SHINE survey. The Eastern European Coalition looked at the Slavic community and their engagement with fish. There was the Brattle Group Fisher Study. And then the last report there from the Portland Harbor Partnership. So each of these documents helped me identify who's eating the fish. I also had a couple of key engagements with some community health workers. One was with ORCHWA, that's the Oregon Community Health Workers Association. I conducted a mini workshop at their conference in 2018 to see what their folks knew about people eating fish on the rivers and how they like to be engaged in this process. And then I met with the community health workers at IRCO, that's a local immigrant and refugee community organization, and talked to them about who do you hear is eating this fish and how do you like to receive this information. And from all of this information gathering, some key groups were identified. The Slavic communities, particularly Russian and Ukrainian speaking folks, as well as the Asian American community, with the Vietnamese community being the largest immigrant and refugee population in that community locally. Looked at the Latinx community, the Black community, which has historically fished along this section of the river, new African immigrants and refugees and others. Next slide, please. So with this information in mind, I designed some workshops to reach out to these folks. And I leaned in on some of my own skills in human-centered design. This is an approach to really engaging the community. Remember, I talked about giving power and voice to the community. It's using a process where you ask the community to solve the problem, but first you give them some information, and then we built upon that information to answer these following questions. The first one is, what is the fish advisory? So that's where some information was given. And then, what do you already know about the problem? And then next it was, how do you like to receive health messages in your community? And then finally, what will you design to convey the message? So out of each of these workshops, several concepts were developed, and then the group as a whole picked their favorite concept. Next slide, please. So this is some of the information that we shared with each workshop. There was a poster of the boundaries of this fish advisory that was shown, and you can see that this extends beyond Portland Harbor. So it goes from the Selwood Bridge all the way up to the confluence, or where the Willamette River meets the Columbia River, as well as up the Multnomah Channel to the Sobey Island Bridge. And we also put some key fishing sites on this map, because when you talk about the lower Willamette River, people don't always know what you're talking about, because I always thought that was the upper Willamette River, but the river flows north, so it's the lower Willamette River. And so some of the key fishing sites are Kelly Point Park. People often recognize that. Cathedral Park, Swan Island, Fred's Marina, Tom McCall Waterfront Park, East Bank Esplanade, and that's where a lot of the docks are, like the Duckworth Dock, where people fish. Then there's Oaks Bottom and Willamette Park. So once they identified the area that we were talking about, we shared some information about the advisory. So on the lower Willamette Fish Advisory, it shows the migratory fish that are safe to eat. So those are the fish that just travel through this section, but don't spend their whole life there. And then those that are recommended that they are limited because of the health risk. And then those that are recommended that you don't eat at all because of their contamination. I will note right here that there is going to be a new advisory released later this week around sturgeon. And it's not going to be part of the lower Willamette River Fish Advisory. It's species specific, but it does cover the same section of the river. So that's something we'll incorporate into our talking points as we share this information with the community. Next slide, please. So here's a list of the 10 workshops that were held from September of 2018 to July of 2019. And you can see we targeted a lot of the communities that typically eat the resident fish or shellfish, but we also had a meeting with the Portland Harbor Insiders. Those were folks like the Bass and Pan Fishing Club, the Portland Harbor Community Coalition, the City of Portland, the Audubon Society, the Northeast Neighborhood Association, and some houseless folks and others. And then the Portland Harbor Community Coalition hosted 2 workshops that were community-wide. In fact, this picture is from one of those workshops. Next slide, please. All right, on this slide, I'm not going to read all the quotes, but I want you to skim through them. But I would like to draw your attention to the first quote, because it really captures what our objective was for these workshops. Where someone wrote, "I like that it wasn't just information or info being given. We got to actually start planning change in the community." So that's where we are really utilizing the skill and the impact that community members can have within their own communities. And I'll give you just another minute to read through those other quotes. All right, next slide, please. So this infographic is just a synopsis of what I was telling you. There were those 10 community-based workshops. And then the key messages that these workshops identified, and thankfully they cover what we were hoping they would pick up on, is that resident fish are unhealthy to eat. In this section of the river, there are health risks to eating the fish. And I really like the third key message: a clean environment benefits everyone. And then their concept or their tailored outreach spanned everything from radio to social media, newspaper ads, events, a game, training, etc. So we reached over 178 folks through these workshops, and we are using the information that we gathered from these workshops to continue to tailor the outreach. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there are 3 key components, and the first one is a community education campaign. So messages have to be delivered in a variety of ways and in multiple ways. We hope to use this logo and brand our materials and our outreach. This logo and tagline were developed with help from the workshops. So the tagline is "Know Your River, Know Your Food," and then you can see the St. John's Bridge with the Portland skyline in the distance. It's not to scale, but it gives the perspective about where this advisory is. And then there are 3 resident fish in the foreground. I believe that's bass, carp, and catfish. So in this education campaign, I'm going to share some things we've already done, like this logo, and then some things that we hope to do in the future. So we hope to maybe develop yard signs in multiple languages to get the information out. The city of Portland has used the 20 is plenty to get people to slow down yard sign, and we at the county have used the skip the fire, love your lungs yard sign to get people to understand the relationship between wood smoke and air quality. So we're hoping to do something like that. A lot of folks think of signs when they think about a fish advisory, because many of you have seen the signs that are down by the river. We were not a part of developing those signs, but in the future we could be, and we would be installing replacement signs as needed and possibly additional signage. And we want to update them with what the community says is needed, as well as using multiple languages, making them readable by the visually impaired, and most importantly, giving information on how to find out more about the fish advisory and where to go to get that information. Next slide, please. Another component of the social or of the community education campaign is using social media. And so far we have used Facebook and Twitter. We hope to use other means as well, like Snapchat or Nextdoor in the future. But with Facebook, we've done 2 things. One thing we did was put up an ad that was tailored specifically to outdoors people and fisher people within the 25 miles of Portland. And it was in Russian, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Spanish, and it reached over 26,000 people. It was a targeted ad. We also put up a quiz that people could interact with in multiple languages, and we used that quiz in our county health clinic waiting rooms as well. We have TV monitors in the waiting rooms, and the quiz flipped through on the screen. And right now, I'd like to introduce the next slide, where all of you are going to be able to interact with this quiz. It's been adapted, so it's not the exact quiz that we used on Facebook or in our clinics. But if you will click on the link that's shared in the chat, or hold your phone up to the QR code, your phone camera, you should be able to activate this quiz for yourself. And I'd like you to interact and answer the questions, and then Triangle Associates will be putting up the results as we go along. Does anybody have any questions on how to engage in this quiz? There's also a website there. Can you see it? It's listed in the chat. Thank you, Triangle, for doing that.
All right, is everyone able to see the screen? Should see staying healthy quiz, eating fish from the Willamette River. So I'm going to go ahead and advance.
Looks
here.
good.
Great, thank you. All right, so we have contaminated fish always look sick. Looks like overwhelming number of responses. All of the responses say false. We'll let folks finish really quickly. And let's take a look at the correct answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're seeing the same screen because it's highlighting false, which everyone says was the answer. It is the correct answer. Contaminated fish do not always look sick. So moving on. Which of these fish live their whole lives in the lower Willamette and are highly exposed to contaminants from the riverbed? Salmon, bass, carp. Got a little bit more diversity here. And if you're just joining, we are currently taking a quiz. If you want to go to menti.com and use the code 918382, you can hop right in. All right, I'll go ahead and share the correct answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And bass and carp were the correct answers. Great job, everyone. All right, third question. Contaminants in the river affect all fish the same. All right, looks like we have 28 answers, 30. Nearing the max, it looks like folks are in general agreement that is false, but let's see. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that is false. Contaminants in the river do not affect all fish the same. Next question, you can cook or wash mercury out of fish. Is that true or false? All right, get your answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Looks like we're in agreement that it's false. Let's check it out. And it is false. Does not look like you can cook or wash mercury out of fish. And it looks like we might have had some folks jump ahead here. That's totally fine. If you have not had a chance to vote on this question, PCBs are a blank, or what kind of chemical potentially harmful to fish species when they make their way into a river ecosystem? Are they bacterial, cyano, human-made, or a general toxin? Since we got a head start on this one, I'm going to go ahead and reveal the correct answer. And it looks like the correct answer is human-made. PCBs are a human-made chemical potentially harmful to fish species. Next question. These are some of the health risks of eating contaminated fish from the lower Willamette River. You are able to choose all that apply here. Great, looks like answers are coming in. We have damage to the developing brain, rash, increased risk of cancer, problems with hormones, hair loss. We've got 27 folks. I'll go ahead and count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like the correct The correct answers are damage to the developing brain, increased risk of cancer, and problem with hormones. All right, and that looks like it's the end of our quiz. Thanks everyone for participating and helping Beth test that neat Mentimeter tool. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for just a moment and then transition back to Beth's presentation. Beth, anything you'd like to say about that experience?
No, thank you, Alyssa, and you all did really well on that. But a lot of those questions were built around misconceptions that I heard in the community. So you might be more familiar with the answers, but it was a really fun way to interact with folks. And we hope to do more surveying or quizzes in the future, because just getting information and not engaging with it does not really stick with folks as much as a way to engage with it. So thank you. And on this next slide here, this is another community education campaign, and it's using fact sheets and flyers. And you can see on the left, one of the flyers was incorporated into the Slavic festival brochure in Russian. So we go to events like that, but they often will allow us to then share information. So that was a really great way for people to take home what they saw. And on the right, you can see some flyers in Chinese, I believe it's Spanish and Arabic. And I looked at, or I asked Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where are the locations that fishing licenses are sold in Multnomah County? And they gave me a list of them. And then my colleague who's on the call, Brendan Haggerty, helped me pinpoint the 3 top languages other than English that were spoken in that census tract where that venue was located. And I went out and took these brochures and set them up. This was a really cool one out of Fred Meyer's because it was right above the free fishing weekend flyer. So it really drew people in. But if people see something in the language that they are comfortable in or is their first language, they're more likely to pick it up. So this was exciting. I think more people are buying their licenses online now, so we're going to have to get more creative in how we share this information. I want to mention that besides the languages that you see there, they were also translated into Vietnamese. There are English, Hmong, and I think you see the Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, and Russian. All right, next slide, please. So part of this community education campaign involves interactive activities. And an idea that came out of one workshop was to play a game and have families interact around the information. So we have developed this Go Fish game, and these are actual cards here that are in the game, and they represent different fish and shellfish from the lower Willamette River in a fun way. And then there's information given on which ones are healthy and which ones are not so healthy to eat. And we've translated this game into Russian, Vietnamese, and Spanish as well. And they'll be used with our community outreach when we are working with community health workers. We also recently developed a video with some anglers or fishers. In fact, Yevgeny was one of the folks. You might see him on the dock in that picture on the top with his son. And those are going to be released next month. We're working on a press release that we have an English language version, a Chinese language version, and a Russian language version. So you should be looking for those to be released probably early next month. We have talked with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife about a fishing derby as well. We hope to do some cooking classes and then develop a calendar of events. I like the calendar that was shared earlier, and we can put some things on there as well, but in another venue as well that reaches the general population. Some other interactive activities could be radio. I know Yevgeny interviewed me on Slavic Family Media. Do you remember that, Yevgeny? It was really fun. So I spoke in English, but it was translated into Russian, and Yevgeny interviewed me in Russian. So we hope to do more radio spots. We've also been in several newspapers reaching Chinese and Vietnamese folks, but we haven't reached out to the television stations yet, but hopefully we'll do some PSAs or things like that as well. All right, next slide, please. So the next area of the program is direct outreach and education. And here you can see we like to attend events. And this Tet Festival, which is celebrating the Vietnamese New Year, was the last event I attended with Laura from EPA in January of 2020 before the pandemic. And I might mention at this point that the last 2 years, I've been pulled away to COVID outbreak work, but I'm back 100% to this project. So last year, we only were able to go to 3 events, and that was the last one we attended there on the right, the Slavic Cultural Festival in September of 2021. But we like to partner with other folks, and at the county, it's been great to partner with the vaccine outreach team. We have our community partnerships team that are represented in this photo, as well as emergency management and other environmental health issues as well. So we want to really target priority community events like these and others like the Jade International Night Market, which we've attended. Next slide, please. Part of direct engagement or outreach is really targeting the most vulnerable to this advisory. And that would be people that are pregnant, because fetuses are very susceptible to these contaminants, as well as small children. So people that are pregnant or breastfeeding, and then small children. So I developed a workshop that we did online because of the pandemic with WIC, which is our Women, Infant, and Children department at the county. And we held 2 online classes that reached about 18 people. We really were hoping to do them in person because they're very interactive. But we talked about, in general, how fish can be healthy to eat. And then we went into more detail about fishing and eating fish from the lower Willamette River. Besides WIC, we've also reached out and developed flyers for the Healthy Birth Initiative at the county. And that department works with Black and African immigrant folks and mainly folks that have small children again. And we've also partnered with the Future Generations Collaborative at the county, and they work with the Native community and also with folks that are parenting small children. And we develop flyers for them as well. So we hope to really broaden that work. It's just started, so we hope to really develop it further. Next slide, please. And finally, the last prong of this program is capacity building of communities affected by the advisory. And what we did with this component is develop a community health worker training. And we had it approved for continuing ed credits at the state. The state office, or the Oregon Health Authority's Office of Equity and Inclusion, gives out CEU credits to community health workers who are accredited. I don't know if many of you know that they're actual jobs in the community. And community health workers are embedded in the community. They're members of the community they work with, and they are trusted in their community. So we hope to really build this component of the program. In November of 2020, we were approved for this training. And then the pandemic was in full force. But we did sign a pilot agreement with Familias in Acción, which is a group that works with Spanish-speaking community health workers. And we hope to do our first inaugural training in September last year, but because of Delta, we were unable to. We had even signed up to use Green Anchors over by Cathedral Park to do this training, and it's an outdoor venue. But we decided to postpone it at that time, and it's set now for either late spring or early summer. And it does involve a component of getting out on a boat on the river so people can see what we're talking about, because then it really becomes real. And it does involve training a community health worker co-facilitator. So that would be someone in the community then that will continue to monitor and develop this program with us. So we talked about the pilot project. We also are working with the Native Wellness Institute and their community health workers, and also with Russian-speaking community health workers, in hopes that they'll be signed up to do a training within the next year. So there's some short and long-term outcomes that we hope to see from this program. A short-term outcome is that these community health workers will know about the advisory and will know about what the Superfund site is, and that they will develop a work plan to share this information. We also hope to work together to continually develop new tools to use in those communities. And then long-term, there will be these champions within these communities that will continue to stay abreast of the most recent news about the fish advisory, and they will tell others about it, and people will know not to eat the fish. They will stop eating those resident fish and shellfish, and health outcomes will be better. Next slide, please. So to make a program really effective, it's helpful to know what the impact is. And it's hard to measure all these things. We can count how many flyers were distributed or how many events we went to and how many people came, but we want to get deeper than that. So we've talked with a unit that's embedded within Multnomah County Health Department and the Oregon Public Health Division. They're called Program Design and Evaluation Services. So we've been talking with them for a couple of years on how to really measure this and how to evaluate the impact, particularly of the community health worker outreach, because that is something that we can really measure. So we plan on doing some post-training surveys and key informant interviews, and then seeing, do they recall what they were taught? How have they used this? Do people in the community understand what they've learned? And then we'll revise the program based on the findings and share those findings out with other folks. PDES, which is a shorthand for Program Design and Evaluation Services, has been really busy with COVID work. So this next year, we'll do some post-training surveys about 6 months after the trainings, but they probably won't come on board until the following year. All right, next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide. I want to let you all know that when remedial action construction activities start in about 3 years, people will be asked not to eat any resident fish or shellfish. So right now you see there's some that are limited, but eventually it will be 0. So this is, I'm going to take a sip of water because I'm losing my voice. Excuse me just a minute. So this is important information, and the Oregon Health Authority will be notified when this starts, and they'll update their advisory, and then we'll be notified as well and make sure we share that information in the community. All right, next slide, please. All right, finally, I really want to thank the City of Portland, the Port of Portland, and the state of Oregon who funded this project so far. And I don't know if we have any time for questions now. I'll pass it over to Alyssa and Lucila. And if we don't, please know that you can come to the breakout at 7, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much.